Explained by the Billy Meier contacts. Mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Atlantis, see also Hyperborea, a Hyperboreans, see also Mu, lost continent. Contact Report 009.
At our fifth contact, I finished the history of humankind at the time when 50,000 years ago, according to earthly calendar, our homeworlds found freedom and peace. Before that time, 70,000 human beings fled under the leadership of the scientist Pelagon. With spaceships, which they had seized, they fled through the space out of another configuration of space and time into the one of the Milky Way of the Dern universe and settled on the Earth. Under Pelagon's leadership, there were 200 sub-leaders, scientists who were each responsible for a specific field of knowledge. Pelagon was unanimously recognized and respected by them and all others as king of essence of wisdom, Wish, God. In the course of the millennia, they built large cities and inhabited all continents of the earth. Unfortunately, this only went well for barely 10,000 years before lust for might regained the upper hand and a deadly war raged over the world. Everything without residue was destroyed, and only a few thousand human beings were able to survive, while others fled again into the outer space and into the old space-time configuration and settled on distant worlds. For the next 7,000 years, the Earth was no longer flown to, during which time those who stayed behind became completely wild and degenerated. After that, the descendants of those who had settled on distant worlds returned. Again, they were led by an Ishwish. Under such a kind of Ishwish command, the distant descendants later built Atlantis and Mu, 2 huge cities on 2 different continents. For thousands of years, they lived in complete friendship and in peace, until some scientists again succumbed to the greed for might and wanted to seize the rule. However, having become tired of the constant wars, the peoples rose against them. Hence, they seized spacecrafts and fled into the outer space, according to earthly calendar about 15,000 years ago. For 2 millennia, they and their descendants lived in a neighboring solar system. 2 millennia during which they had become very evil and were only able to uphold a certain regulation under the strictest discipline. Through mutations and researches, they achieved a very long lifespan, which amounted to more than 3,000 years. Obsessed with imperiousness, they left their world about 13,500 Earth years ago and came back to the Earth. Their supreme leader was the scientist Arus, who was also called the Barbarian. As already Ishwish Pelagon nearly 190,000 years ago, he also had 200 leaders or sub-leaders who were each responsible for a specific field of knowledge. They settled in 2 parts in the far north and in today's America, Florida, whereby they constantly forged ahead to Atlantis and Mu in order to invade them with war. And only a few millennia after their renewed requisitioning of the Earth, they succeeded in completely destroying Mu and Atlantis. Few survivors went into servitude, while great scientists were able to flee and returned to the original homeworlds in the Pleiades. But thousands of years before that point in time, the new intruders spread across the earth, and Ishwish Arus ruled with a firm and bloody hand.
Contact Report 055.
Atlantis was divided into 2 kingdoms. The Great Atlantis was located between the divided continents of America, South America, and Europe, Africa, while the small Atlantis was located in the Santorini region. Great Atlantis was destroyed and sank into the sea through war feuds with the inhabitants of Mu, which lay in the Chinese Gobi Desert. But Mu was also destroyed and ceased to exist, leaving only the underground city of Akarta. Small Atlantis was destroyed about 6,000 years later, indirectly by the gigantic destroyer, the giant comet, which brought Venus into the Sol system 3,500 years ago. The enormous vibrations of the destroyer racing by and the following Venus caused enormous damage on Earth. It trembled, burst in many places, and huge volcanoes erupted. One of them was the existing Santorini. It exploded and tore various islands down into the sea within a wide radius, while the sea began to bubble and an approximately 2,000-meter-high tidal wave was generated, which rolled over today's Crete to Egypt and Syria. Crete was called Minoa at that time, and its inhabitants were Atlantean descendants. Many of them were still able to flee to the Hellenic mainland and thus save themselves. Minoa remained an island, but most of the islands of Little Atlantis around Santorini sank.
Contact Report 060.
As I already explained at an earlier point in time, Atlantis and Mu destroyed one another. However, this was a peculiar case, and I have to begin to recount from a very early time. About 150,000 Earth years ago, after a very long time of wars and of uprisings, our home planets finally found peace and freedom. Many millennia after the creation of calmness, peace, and freedom. However, a scientist called Pelagon made himself the leader of a group consisting of about 70,000 human beings, and with their help, he appropriated numerous large spaceships and fled. As a great scientist, it was an easy thing for him to force the 70,000-strong group under his control and to bring them to the Earth in a frantic escape through space and time. On board of his stolen spaceships were close to 200 very good scientists of the most varied fields of knowledge. From them, and also from the whole group, Pelagon was unanimously accepted as God, thus as the king of wisdom and leader. During the following millennia, their descendants lived on the earth and built up a high culture. They built many and large cities and inhabited all continents of the earth. Their flourishing lasted close to 10,000 years. During this time, all went well, and everything found a very high level of development. However, before the 10,000 years were completed, dissatisfaction erupted again through the lust for might of some that were greedy for might, which led to deadly wars that made the entire earth tremble with wild war cries. An Earth-World War took place to the extent as has never happened before and has not been brought to Earth since. Everything, but really completely everything that the ones who had come from space had built up, was destroyed and annihilated, and only a few thousand human beings of these extraterrestrials survived the tremendous catastrophe. These, however, fled with good and far-reaching spaceships out into space and settled on foreign worlds. Only a very small remnant remained on the destroyed Earth and degenerated completely, whereby they lived completely separately from the small group of Earth-born humans of that time. When after around 7,000 years the distant descendants of the ones that fled came back to Earth, they therefore found only extremely wild and degenerated individuals of their forefathers, who lived, as said before, far away from the Earth humans. The return of the descendants of the former fugitives happened again under the leadership of a god, under whose rule Mu as well as Greater Atlantis and Lesser Atlantis were built. At that time, Greater Atlantis and Mu were the two most gigantic cities which had ever been built on the earth, and for the sake of peace, they were built on two different continents. Again, a high culture was built up and everything began to blossom. During a few millennia, complete unity and peace prevailed, Before some scientists, in their greed for might, Ausartetan got very badly out of control of the good human nature again, and with all means available to them, tried to seize dominion. The peoples, however, with the distant memory of the wars of their forefathers, rose up against the might-craving scientists, so the scientists had to flee. Through some allies that were well disposed towards them, they were able to appropriate several spaceships and fled into outer space. Calculated in Earth years, this was a little more than 150,000 years ago. During the following tens of thousands of years, these evil-minded refugees lived in a different space and time configuration to our Pleiades. In a neighboring solar system, fathered many descendants and developed a high technology which offered them tremendous possibilities. This technology, however, they furthered only in hatred and revenge, because they thereby wanted to bring the Earth under their gestalt. Through their government, the hatred and pathological craving for revenge of the descendants was constantly stirred up and driven so far that in their own ranks, a certain order could be maintained only with very great effort and dreadful punishments. Thus, a people of malicious and bestial nature came into being. It was also their hatred through which the average life expectancy of these hate-filled human beings was driven up by means of research, gene manipulation, and through mutations and so forth, so that in the end it amounted to several thousands of years. Each individual human being of this people was taught in the art of war and in the most outrageous intrigues. After 2,000 years, these hateful people had progressed so far that an attack on the Earth could be considered. Thus, they got on their way, climbed on board of their large spaceships, and came to the Earth. This was around 103,000 Earth years ago. Their leader was the Jeshwish Arus Ishwish, the barbarian, and scientist of an extremely bestial disposition and of coercive might. For his help, he had appointed many scientists of most varied disciplines as deputies and sub-leaders, 200 in number. Suddenly and predatorily, they pounced on the Earth and stole new land for themselves. Thus, they were then able to colonize the north of America. It is the present-day Florida, which came to rest in the present-day South only due to a shift of the Earth. From there, they won a great might over the Earth for themselves, whereby they continuously fought Atlantis and Mu. Constantly, they pushed forward to Greater Atlantis and Mu in order to bring these cities into their possession through acts of war. Thus, for many further millennia, worldwide wars blazed, before evil elements of the hate-filled human beings were able to infiltrate into the ruling elite of Atlantis and Mu, who secretly stirred up hatred and gestalt, until Greater Atlantis and Mu were completely destroyed through the intrigues, whereby few survivors went into servitude, while great scientists were able to flee with their spaceships and returned to the former homeworlds of our 7 stars, being our Pleiades, which were settled by the earliest forefathers when they left their original homeworlds in another space-time configuration in the Vega Lyra region. However, the form in which Greater Atlantis and Mu were destroyed was of such intrigues and full of horror that, in the history of the human beings of the Earth, it will probably never be paralleled. The intriguers stirred up malicious machinations between the Atlanteans and the citizens of Mu, which led to mutual actions of war. Between both arose malicious hatred and the will to destroy. Mu, which was in the Gobi Desert, feuded with Greater Atlantis, which was built in the great island kingdom between present-day Africa and America, before it sank in the Atlantic due to the greatest earthly war catastrophe of all past and probably also future times, leaving behind only a few small islands, which today you call the Azores. At their time, the war powers of Mu and Atlantis were of horrendous might and size, and equipped with the highest technological achievements. So, Greater Atlantis alone had at its disposal an army of 4,83,430,000 men, which was equipped with small combat beamships. Furthermore, the government of Atlantis commanded a giant fleet of 123,000 units of single-person destroyers, miniature beamships for close Earth combat. In addition, there existed another 16,431 eliminator units, miniature beamships, which, through the effects of heat, were able to totally eliminate all material within fractions of a second. Finally, they were equipped also with 24,230 overkill beamers, each of which required 10 people to operate, and were installed in mid-range beamships. To this tremendous might Mu was inferior, which however did not make it less dangerous for the greater Atlanteans, because the Mu scientists had likewise developed very dangerous weapons, which in many ways were even more dangerous and more destructive than everything of the Atlanteans altogether. The scientists of Mu had in fact discovered powers, which made it possible for them to convert entire small planets into all-destroying space bombs, by pulling them out of their orbit of millions of years and with extreme precision steering them onto a carefully determined target of another planet and letting them crash down with devastating force and explode above the target. And it was exactly this frightful weapon they used when Greater Atlantis commenced the full-scale attack against Mu. The best and the most suitable scientists of Mu were charged with finding a suitable planetoid which could be used as a deadly and annihilating missile against Atlantis. Thus they flew with their ships out into space and found in the asteroid belt, outside of the Mars orbit, an object suitable for their purpose. It was a planetoid of several kilometers diameter. However, we are not able to analyze its exact size anymore. By means of atomic and electroenergetic energies, it was thrown out of its orbit and brought onto course towards Earth. After that, the planetoid's own rotation was slowed down and brought to a standstill, whereupon on the side turned away from the Earth, a drive unit of gigantic size was installed for the purpose of a tremendous acceleration of the small planet, which was supposed to be directed to its destination with breakneck speed. Only less than half a day before the full-scale attack of Atlantis against Mu, the deadly space bomb was completed, a death messenger of human insanity and of tremendous consequence. When Atlantis undertook the attack, the producers of the death missile were informed within a few seconds by means of hyperwave impulses about the oncoming events and were charged with allowing the death missile to take off. A few seconds after receiving the command, on the side of the planetoid facing away from the Earth, 1,000 suns appeared to race into the dark space, and with gigantic force, the monster started moving. Very quickly, the speed of the messenger of death increased, steered by scientists controlling the monster, who were sitting on the planetoid completing their task and thereby were doomed to die. In the meantime, on the Earth, the Atlanteans eliminated the city of Mu and leveled it. Whoever had not fled into the satellite cities, thousands of meters deep underground or into space, perished in the totally eliminating rays of the Atlanteans, and nothing bore witness any more to their former existence. The victorious Atlanteans, however, returned to their gigantic island kingdom and celebrated their victory achieved over Mu in a true delirium of joy. However, their joy did not last long because they had barely begun their festivities when messages came thick and fast in regard to the danger rushing towards them through space. Only a few high government officials and scientists were still able to clear out and flee with their spaceships into space before the catastrophe was unleashed over Atlantis and made it sink into the sea. The ones left behind and doomed to die saw the disaster racing towards them, high in the sky and far in the northwest above the sea and the far continent. As if out of nothing, a dark celestial body suddenly appeared, which advanced at frantic speed, with its far side blasting off blinding light. The Colossus came rushing in quite low, and in a few seconds turned into a giant. First only visible like a small shooting star, in a few seconds it turned to a gigantic size with a fiery tail. Fascinated and transfixed, dilated pupils from fright, the human beings stared ominously towards the approaching monster, which so completely silently sped towards them, then, however, suddenly gave out an unbearable howling sound as it plunged into and rubbed against the first levels of the atmosphere of the Earth, inducing its resistance. 2 seconds later, the planetoid began to glow like a supernova and created a heat of more than 340,000 degrees. In a split second, vast areas of country burnt to smoldering ash when the enormous heat fell down from the speeding giant. Then the space bomb suddenly exploded at less than 172 kilometers altitude and transformed into many thousands of small and larger meteorites, which, like small atomic bombs, were catapulted to Earth, and with devastating impact destroyed everything that got in the way and which was in the areas of impact and shock waves. Through the tremendous explosion, the whole Earth was shaken, and the thunder of the explosion rolled around the entire globe. The planet was shaken badly, and many volcanoes erupted out of it. 2 large parts of the exploding planetoid crashed like titanic fists into the Atlantic and pierced through the hard crust of the Earth on the bottom of the ocean. It was as if the world was going under, because the power of impact of the debris was greater than many hydrogen bombs such as you insanely possess today. Deep in the ocean, the Earth's crust was torn apart, and the way opened for the boiling hot and glowing magma of the inner Earth, which now viscously poured out. The seawater began to bubble and boil, vaporizing masses of water which shot up into the atmosphere, up to 35,000 meters high. Through all of this happening, the wild ocean was thrown up into a gigantic tsunami wave, which surged forward with frantic speed and a height of 2,300 meters, pulled along everything, and simply let entire countries sink into the water, or at least destroyed whatever was in its path. The island empire of Atlantis, however, sank within a few minutes in the raging waters of the Atlantic without even leaving one single surviving life form behind. The capital city, which was built like a beam ship, was torn into several pieces and sank with the foundation. This is how the event with Atlantis and Mu unfolded about 9,500 years before today's calendar.
Fantastic. But from where do you have this knowledge?
It was handed down to us.
Phenomenal. But you said just a moment ago that these events belong to the past 9,500 years before our calendar, as you say. Is this date exact?
Certainly, up to 2 years exactly. Calculated back, it is exactly 9,598 years before the start of the current calendar. If you go from the year 2000, then it is exactly 11,498 years.
Here I have received a magazine article from one of our group members. In that a man named Otto Muck, a German physicist, has calculated that Atlantis must have been destroyed at exactly 19, 0 or hers on the 6th of June of the year 8498 BC, and indeed precisely as you have just told it, only that he thinks that it was a purely cosmic catastrophe.
That does not surprise me.
So, and why not? This man has after all calculated everything very precisely, up to the year exactly, only that he erred by 1,000.
Sure, that is a miscalculation, because he relied on information, which is incorrect by years. Additionally, he assumes that through the Mu Atlantis events, Noah's flood was triggered, which is not true.
That is known to me. However, I really thought that you would be surprised about the calculation and explanation, which in my opinion is very remarkable.
Why should I? The explanations of this Earth-human muck are very well known to us. Also the fact that he, apart from the calculation of the year, is very close to the truth in certain things. But he must indeed know this, because only through one of his earlier personalities were the legends about Atlantis recorded in writing for posterity for the first time 2,122 years ago.
You are driving me crazy. You actually think that one of the earlier personalities of this muck was the former Plato?
I do not think so. We know it very exactly. Here, just draw a comparison with these two pictures. Here is a bust of Plato, and here is the picture of Otto Muck. Does anything stand out for you?
Man, girl, that fits. Both of them are almost the same faces. Consequently, Otto Muck must still today show a relationship with his former existences.
Certainly since then it has been inherited down through one family lineage.
That is really fantastic, if that man knew it.
Unfortunately, he is not very responsive to such things.
All right, then. But may you now answer a question concerning these minor planets or planetoids, namely, what is the Adonis group about? Mr. Muck writes that the space projectile was a body of the Adonis group, which I cannot imagine.
It is very easy to explain. The Adonis group includes all those celestial or space bodies which are called planetoids.
Oh, then an Adonis group member simply means planetoid? How complicated people can be.
That is unfortunately so. For many years now, we have been keeping an eye on Otto Muck, who also has been inspired by us for certain things. First, he was supposed to go public informatively on a large scale with the results of his research, in order to prepare the human beings of the Earth for the full truth about the events surrounding Atlantis and Mu at that time. This he has done, on one hand through a book, and on the other hand also through the newspaper article that you have shown me. Thereby the ground is prepared to reveal the complete truth.
Contact Report 061.
These events took place from today, calculated 11,474 years ago.
Please tell us in turn from that time on, since Mu and Atlantis were destroyed. That is to say, from the year 9498 BC. Atlantis was destroyed by Mu scientists, as I explained to you recently. This was 9498 years ago BC, as you yourself have just correctly noticed. This was the first major catastrophe of the last 10,000 Earth years BC.
Contact Report 070 and note. Sentences 110 to 134 have additional explanations given in Contact 703 by tar. For 700 years the Earth was simply avoided, before the descendants of the fugitives set out again to populate the beautiful blue world again. These new arrivals, or the distant descendants of those who had left the Earth earlier, were on the one hand not Titans, but human beings of smaller dimensions, but they too were not exactly of a peaceful nature, but nevertheless no longer as warlike as their ancestors. This was 133,000 Earth years ago, according to your current chronology. The returnees were led by an Jeshwish with the name Atlant, married to an Jeshwish named Caryatide. In the latest episode, under the leadership of Atlant, the continent of Atlantis, which had been headed for again and again, and used for millennia, was expanded and made habitable, while under the command of his wife Caryatide, Lesser Atlantis came into existence, as at the same time her cousin Muras built the gigantic city of Mu, which, like Atlantis, also found its origin in very early times. The reason for the construction of these cities so far apart was that the humans had become cleverer through all the wars, and hoped for peace as a result of the great distance between the cities, if everyone stayed in their domains. So it went well for many long years, the whole 1,800 years, to be precise. Then, however, again some scientists exalted themselves, whipped up by lust for might, and tried to snatch up control for themselves. After the death of Atlant, his wife Caryatide and Muras, various other leaders took over. This time, however, they had not reckoned on the people's memory of war, which had been passed down over the ages. The law was only maintained by those who returned, but not by those who remained on earth, who were deprived of all achievements and values by a complete destruction of all technical, cultural and other things, whereby they finally gradually withered away, and became savage beings who fell into barbarism, and eventually died out. So before the scientists could strike, the folk rose up against them. Through an accomplice, the scientists obtained possession of spaceships, and fled into the space-time shifted regions of Beta Centauri. This was 115,000 Earth years ago. After 2,000 years, during which the malicious refugees again created a high technological standard and produced many descendants, they returned filled with hate to the Earth. After they had increased their hate immeasurably against the extraterrestrial inhabitants of the Earth, and were only able to preserve order within their own ranks with terrible punishments. Spurred on through their inhuman hate, they, through research and the knowledge obtained from it, drove up their life expectancy to more than 1,000 years. 123. Their single wish was, however, to gain control over the Earth, for which reason every individual was taught wicked intrigues, and was instructed in the craft of war. After 2,000 years, this hate-drenched people was so far along that it could venture an attack on the Earth. Therefore it manned its ships and came newly to the Earth, and indeed under the leadership of the Jeshwish Arus, the barbarian. This happened 113,000 years ago. Arus was extremely bestial and barbarous in his disposition, and his power was feared. Like Pelagon, already thousands of years before, Arus also had 200 high-level scientists with him, who he made sub-leaders. In a lightning action they fell upon the Earth, robbing, murdering, and taking possession of the land. Primarily, they conquered the distant land in the northern regions, where the climate was moderate and very good. These were those regions which are traditionally known to you as Hyperborea, and which were far in the north, before an upset of the Earth shifted its axis, so that the then regions exist today, where you name Florida. Coming from the north, Arus's son, Arus II, set out and fell upon those lands which today you call India, Pakistan and Persia, and so forth, whereby they struck the earliest forefathers of the Sumerians, who, peace-loving, fled and set down far in the south, folk of dark-colored skin, but by your terms, not Negroid, but like Europeans and of tall growth, risen from a race of former Syrian refugees, who had likewise settled on the Earth 133,000 years ago, as did the refugees from the Pleiadian system. Named after Arus II, the India of today was at that time called Aryan, which, however, split off from Hyperborea after a few centuries. After 210 years, to be exact, and joined with the inhabitants of Mu and Agartha, while from Hyperborea, Arus I constantly troubled Mu and Greater Atlantis by wicked war activities, in order to become their ruler. During around half a millennia, or said very precisely, during 502 years, those war machinations continued, until Arus I, who in the meanwhile had become old and weak, succeeded in infiltrating wicked elements of his hater humans into the leading controlling ranks of Atlantis and Mu, who secretly stirred up violence and hate for so long, as also did their descendants over several centuries, until, through boundless intrigues, Mu and Atlantis were able to be completely destroyed some centuries later, while the only few survivors were beaten into servitude. However, great scientists, in knowledge of the coming things and conscious of their powerlessness, set off in spaceships and fled towards the early home worlds in the Pleiadian systems, where they were affably received. Only small peoples remained on Earth, whose ancestors had long since mixed with early Earth humans who had emerged from Earth's development and created their own cultures. I indeed do not need to speak yet again about the destruction of Atlantis and Mu, because you will find that as a separate chronicle in the explanations given to you. Contact Report 150: Destruction of the continent of Atlantis, as a result of a war feud with Mu, whereby Mu scientists directed a minor planet Adonis equals the ugly, as opposed to Ardonis equals the beautiful, from the asteroid belt and steered it towards the Earth and onto Atlantis, causing it to sink into the sea and triggering a flood. Contact Report 219.
So thus the next question, namely about Atlantis. If I remember correctly, Simyase once said that there had not been only two Atlantises, the Great Atlantis and the Small Atlantis. Do you know about this?
Yes. There were 4 different Atlantises, so the new Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, between the Azores and Spain. Then there was the small Atlantis that existed in the Mediterranean Sea, in the area of Santorini, and then Old Atlantis is to be mentioned, on which later, after its downfall, Troy was built, while Great Atlantis had its existence in the Atlantic. The Atlanteans of Great Atlantis were the rulers over all 4 Atlantises and their peoples, for they all belonged to the same origin. Thus, a central government was given, but the administration of the various Atlantises took place through authorized representatives who were called the Lieutenant.
Contact Report 535.
On television, they have once again made a program about the conspiracy theories around the Bermuda Triangle. There is a theory, which we talked about before, that Atlantis existed in that area, which is absolute nonsense, as I know from you, because Atlantis was located elsewhere in the east. But now it is even claimed that in the Bermuda Triangle, in the supposedly sunken Atlantis, there is a giant crystal that emits very strong vibrations, which would cause ships to sink there, and also aeroplanes to crash if they were hit by the crystal vibrations. The reason why there is nothing to be found could be due to time tunnels through which everything disappears. But you once told me that only a few sunken ships and crashed aeroplanes have been found in the Bermuda Triangle because of the currents there, which simply wash away ships and aeroplanes or their debris when they sink and get caught in the currents.
What you say is correct. And of course the story of the Great Crystal is based on a completely absurd conspiracy theory.
Contact Report 844.
You were together in ancient and very early times, so also in places that no longer exist, such as Atlantis and...
Yes, Plato still described that. Consequently, I was already interested in it as a boy, but they were different places and settlements that were called Atlantis and were very far apart. They were all smaller and larger places, But the actual Atlantis that Plato wrote about was not just a place or a city, but